we know that with any mechanical system, you're going to have an environmental impact. But if we're really smart about it, we figure out how energy efficient that system should be, and sometimes back off a little bit to save a lot of money. And then we take that extra money and we put it into solar panels on the roof or on the site that generate all the energy our building needs. There's a study that we really like to do in great detail to figure out where you want to invest your dollars to get the best return on investment for your energy or your EUI, how much energy that project is going to use. And sometimes we'll say, we need really good expensive windows. And after studying it, sometimes we say, you know what, we don't. We can save all that money, put it in solar panels, and be net zero energy. We take the time to study these things out to make sure we're making the right financial choices for our client.
Before we go into the podcast, if you could just go and rate this show on whichever platform you're listening to it, it makes a huge difference to the podcast, the amazing conversations we get to have, and the incredible guests we're able to get on the podcast. So it's probably not something you would think about, but if you could just go rate the show, follow it, or share an episode, it does make a huge difference to the show. Thank you so much. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. How can we design buildings that not only minimize environmental harm, but actively contribute to a better world? That's exactly the mission of Revision Architecture. Scott Kelly, a founding principal, and David Salamon, an associate architect, have spent decades creating buildings that are energy efficient, resource conscious, and beautifully designed to be valued and maintained over time. In this episode, we'll explore how Scott and David turned sustainability into a design philosophy, the lessons they've learned from decades of hands-on and data-driven practice, and how their mantra, think more, build less, can reshape architecture's role in creating a better future. Let's dive in.
I'm Scott Kelly. I'm the founding principal here of Revision Architecture. I split my time between the architecture side of the business and the high-performance building consulting side. And here at Revision Architecture, we do everything we can to follow our mission of helping people plan, design, construct, and operate the built environment in a green and responsible way.
My name is David, and I'm an associate at Revision Architecture. I am an architect and also a sustainability consultant. So I work with, I spend my time designing buildings, and I will also work with other architects to help them achieve their sustainability goals as well.
So thank you so much, Scott and David, for joining me on Building Green today. Scott, you're a partner at Revision, and you're both senior architects and sustainability consultants. And before we explore what sustainability means to both of you and how you approach it in your work, let's start with your personal journeys. So, David, maybe you can talk about what inspired your path into building off-grid and passive solar homes, and maybe how that experience shaped the architect you are today.
Sure. Well, first, thanks again for the invitation. It's really great to talk with you. I've been involved in sustainability. My interest in sustainability started probably when I was in high school. I was a young punk rock skate kid, skating around Philadelphia. And within that music scene, there was this idea of DIY, or do it yourself. And that got me interested in things like farming and construction, and which gradually led me to things like photovoltaics and off-grid living, and which eventually broadened into the idea, the concept of sustainability. I graduated high school, went to art school for a year, and then I dropped out and moved to Boston and got a job doing construction. And the impetus behind that was really that I wanted to learn how to build. I wanted to, again, I was interested in self-sufficiency. I was interested in just knowing those skills of some level of self-reliance. And but sustainability never really left my mind. I was just learning conventional construction at that time. But I had learned about this type of home called an earthship. At some point, I'd stumbled across that in a magazine. It was actually a details magazine, and there was a one-page write-up of this architect named Michael Reynolds, and it was just like a couple paragraphs about him standing in front of a building made entirely out of beer cans laid in concrete. It was called the Castle, and and when I was in art school, I remember this. I called. There was a payphone at the end of the hall, and there's no cell phones yet, and it was all pre-internet. And so I'm calling New Mexico Information from the payphone at the end of the hall, and got the number for Solar Survival Architecture, which was the name of the company at the time, and called them up. At the time, they were having a sale on their How to Build Earthship books. And, I hadn't done construction yet, but I was interested in it. And so I bought all 3 books. And then, a year or so later, when I dropped out of, after I dropped out of art school and I moved to Boston and done a little bit of construction, my girlfriend, who is now my wife, she and I, we eventually traveled to New Mexico. We thought we'd be there for a year. And then it turned out it was about a 15-year journey. But during that time, we ended up, we went out to New Mexico. We met Michael Reynolds. I worked for the company building earthships for a long time. We both volunteered to start, and we ended up building our own earthship as well as the earthships of a lot of other people. That was an incredible education in sustainability. It was a direct hands-on experience of catch water systems, gray water, black water, passive solar design, circular economy, material reuse, recycling, and really about developing a sensitivity of living within your means. Really, when all of your water, when you're living in the desert, and the only water you have is what falls from the sky, you really learn to live within that budget. And that's those lessons really still make, really inform the core of who I am as an architect. When I have a design problem, I often approach it with the thought of how would I build this? And certainly critical regionalism, which is something that I learned about it when I was out there in New Mexico. That still to this day informs my approach to sustainability and design as well.
That's so cool. Such a cool story. I think often there is a problem that architects are rather theoretical and have never built something themselves, which leads to lots of problems.
Yeah, I did everything backwards. I built my house first, and then I went back to school and did the degree and all that stuff. So,
okay. So my personal sustainability journey. So my personal sustainability journey really began with traveling. It began with spending a year in Europe with a backpack, and then coming back here to the U.S. to finish my thesis work, and realizing that I didn't see my own country yet. So I decided, I'm going to take off for 6 months, and I traveled across the U.S., spent a lot of time in the tent and a lot of time in the Volkswagen bus, and begin to think about your environment completely differently. Because where you put your tent means if you're going to have a good time or you're going to be very wet. So you begin to learn those lessons, and even the direction your tent faces in relationship to the morning sun means you'll be warm enough in the morning or you're going to freeze. And that started my sustainability journey. I repeated that trip about 3 years later, and that was really when I got struck. And what I mean by that is I went back to some of the places that I really loved, and I saw, quite frankly, how much damage we did as human beings to some of those places in a 3 or 5 year period. And I decided I couldn't live my life doing that. And so when I came back to Philadelphia and was practicing architecture, I really dedicated myself to understanding the impact that we make and the contribution that we make, which could either be really bad or it can be quite a gift. And that started my journey and then eventually led to the starting of this firm.
As a partner of Revision, what values or principles were kind of non-negotiable when starting the firm?
In starting the firm, our non-negotiable principles were finding the right balance between human habitat and natural habitat. And then considering kind of the social layer that happens there. It was about finding the balance between the built environment, the natural environment, and how it influences us all. And that was non-negotiable. Everything else got built off of that. And even the way that this firm looks at trying to figure out not what less bad is, not just like saving some energy, because that's just doing a little bit less, but how do we create a built environment that actually creates more energy than it needs and then gives that extra energy to its neighbor. And we just kept going from there.
Sustainability can mean so many different things depending on the person or the project. David, what does sustainability mean to you?
Sustainability is an extremely broad term. We say that we practice sustainable architecture or green architecture. I mean, there's so many different terms, right? Bioclimatic architecture. And bioclimatic, it's actually a term that we don't typically use, but in some ways it's probably the most accurate of them. The other terms are more common, but also more nebulous. And so on the one hand, that's a good thing because it can encompass a lot of different things. On the other hand, I think it's important when we're doing this work to be as specific as we can. Philosophically, I generally think that the way I think about it is that there's really no such thing as sustainable architecture, because architecture is a thing and sustainability is the result of the interactions of many, many complex systems. So architecture can be a part of those systems, but anything by itself is not sustainable. It's just that thing. And sustainability, again, it comes about as the way many, 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 many things interact. And so, we talk about sustainability, and I guess when we talk about sustainability, when we approach a project, the question is really about how does that building fit into its context, right? How does that building get light and heat, or how does it cool itself as passively as possible? I guess this kind of, in some ways, it goes back to my initial education and experience with passive solar design. And that's so we always take basically a passive first approach and do as much as we can to just satisfy the comfort and energy requirements of a building passively. Now, we typically can't, satisfy 100% of those requirements passively, but we try to solve as many of them as we can, as passively as we can first, and then we start to add energy efficient systems on top of that.
If I can build on that idea a little bit, something that David and I talk a lot about, is if you think about the relationship of the architect and the engineer, you have the architect who does whatever they want, and then the engineer has to come and supplement and fix it. What David and I in Vision are trying to do is exactly the opposite. The relationship of the architect is the architect does what they want, the engineer has to lift up the architect and hold on and support them. We want to do the opposite. We want the architecture to do the heavy lifting of heating and cooling and generation, and the mechanical engineer just to supplement a little bit. That's the right way to look at it.
Right.
One of the issues about sustainability is the term sustainability is a cover term. It means so many things. Are you talking about sustainability in water, in energy, in materials and toxicity? How about sustainability in the way of beauty, so our buildings are loved? There's all these different parts of sustainability, incredibly complex.
Or even, social equity.
Mm-hmm.
How does what we design and build contribute to social sustainability? And sometimes we get more into that, most often into zoning issues. But it can manifest at the building level as well.
And if we can't provide a good social environment, we have civil unrest, and then nothing's sustainable. We see that happen all over the world. That's part of what we have to address.
And this might come up again later, but I'll just chime in now. What Scott said about beauty. One of the most sustainable things we can do is build beautiful buildings. I feel like there's often this kind of false dichotomy between beauty and sustainability when it comes to architecture. Like, you can either have that gorgeous, eye-catching, exciting building, or it can be sustainable. And I don't believe that is a real choice. There's no reason that you can't have both. We should not have to compromise. If we build ugly buildings that are quote unquote sustainable because they're super energy efficient, people will not take care of them, and then they'll get torn down. And then there's this huge loss of embodied energy and embodied carbon. It is of course not sustainable, right? But if we build a beautiful building, and it should be energy efficient as well. But if we build a beautiful building that people are going to love and maintain and take care of in perpetuity, then that is truly on the path of sustainability.
I totally agree with you. In the end, even though if it's a LEED Platinum certified building, if it's ugly and not very thoughtfully designed, it's going to be destroyed as fast as it came. Didn't we talk about the Louis Kahn Museum?
That's a great example. So back in 23, I was at the FIAS conference in Houston, and I was giving a presentation with some other folks, and someone in the crowd asked about, I can't remember the exact question, but it was essentially like, if he was presenting that choice, it was like, if you could choose between, the whole session was focused on embodied carbon. So he's basically saying, like, if you had to pick between embodied carbon or beauty, like, what do you choose? And I told him how I actually took the opportunity to fly into Dallas-Fort Worth instead of Houston. I rented a car to drive to the conference, but and that was a couple hours away, so I intentionally made my trip more complicated than it needed to be, but because I wanted to go see Lou Kahn's the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, and that building is almost built entirely of concrete, and I studied that building, but I'd never been there. This is the only time I'd been there. There's no way I'm traveling all the way to Texas without seeing it. And I swear to you, Ladina, like, I almost cried. For real. Like, that building was so beautiful. I almost cried. It was really like, we think about the power and the promise of architecture, of buildings to move us. And that building really had that power for me. It was funny. It was an art museum, and I barely looked at the art. I was just looking at the building. I love that building so much. And it's, as you know, if we look at it in terms of embodied carbon, yeah, it's huge, right? But
if we were to do that today, David, you would design that building with half to 1/3 of the embodied carbon footprint.
For sure.
Because now we're smarter.
Right. Now we know different, we could get the same.
What would we do differently now? And by the way, I got goosebumps from your story because I can totally relate to like the fact of finally seeing a building you've been studying for years and you touch it, you kind of hug it.
Yeah. I think there are three primary things that we'd probably consider in rethinking that building. The first is easy, and that is instead of using a traditional Portland cement, we'd use a blended cement, which would cut the embodied carbon footprint of that structure in about half. We've just gotten smarter. Second, we would tweak some of the systems just a little bit to make the building more responsive and a little less of an impact. And third, I think we'd be concentrating on some of the embodied carbon of insulation, systems, insulation, and the concrete.
What kind of systems are we talking about?
Oh, the mechanical systems. So let's just look at that for a moment. We know that with any mechanical system, you're going to have an environmental impact. But if we're really smart about it, we figure out how energy efficient that system should be, and sometimes back off a little bit to save a lot of money. And then we take that extra money and we put it into solar panels on a roof or on the site that generate all the energy our building needs. So there's a study that we really like to do in great detail to figure out where you want to invest your dollars to get the best return on investment for your energy or your EUI, how much energy that project is going to use. And sometimes we'll say, we need really good expensive windows. And after studying it, sometimes we say, you know what, we don't. We can save all that money, put it in solar panels, and be net zero energy. We take the time to study these things out to make sure we're making the right financial choices for our client.
That's so good.
Yeah, we would approach that building the same way today.
But I think one of the great lessons from that building, as constructed, is that like embodied carbon is not a problem in and of itself. It's a problem over time. So that building's been there for quite a while. It's going to be there for a long, long time, and it is loved and will be maintained. And so, if you have a higher embodied carbon, you need a longer time scale to essentially pay that debt down. But if you build a building that's loved, then you can do that.
Even if you look at some of the skyscrapers in Chicago, the old ones, made of masonry, they're over 100 years old, but they're still incredibly energy efficient. Because the advantage of that masonry, even though it had a high embodied carbon footprint, was its durability, the amount of windows that were in it were right. And what I mean by that was there was not too much daylight, not too little. And they still remain some of the most energy efficient buildings in Chicago.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. What do you think about the way we build nowadays with more glass than anything else?
That's one of the biggest issues that we struggle with. The amount of glass we traditionally put in a building is a bit of a problem. If you think about even good glass, let's say I have a heat resistance value, an R value of 4 in that glass. Well, if the R value of the wall behind me is 40, anytime I put more glass than necessary, than really needed to get a high quality space, I'm throwing my money away. So we really do need to think about not overglazing our buildings, which will do two things. It'll make them more energy efficient, more cost effective, and not overlit. You can't function well in a place that has glare. And those factors really influence some of the mistakes that we make today in modern architecture. Those old buildings didn't have a really deep floor plate. Everybody sat next to the window. And now think about what that did for us socially and mentally. We know you're healthier the closer you are to that window. We know you'll work harder. You'll make less errors in what you're doing. That's the human health aspect that we need to pay attention to. Why do we make buildings that are super deep? I don't know. It's just, it's the wrong thing to do. We're learning. It may just take us a little while longer.
Do you have like a rule of thumb when you work on projects and how much glass compared to the room size you put in?
I will say it this way. The code says that you're not supposed to go over 40% glass. The newer codes are going to say 30% glass on a facade. But it's not just the amount of glass on the facade, it's the depth of the floor plate, which makes the difference for the quality of space inside. We've done a lot of work down at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, and one of the things I love about those developers, that's Liberty Property Trust and Ensemble down there, is they've always been willing to do smaller floor plates so everybody is closer to the window. Yeah. And it just makes a better place. Now, I will say one more thing. So, like, I'm sure David's going to talk about doing, the earth ships. A good passive solar building may only have 20% glass. Still beautiful, still daylit. Do you remember the ratios you were working with back then?
No, but they're probably too much. Yeah. And they're also extremely concentrated on just the south facade. Mm-hmm. Most exclusively. There's a little bit east and west, but you're basically asking do we have a typical window wall ratio that we go for? Is it 15, 20, 25%? And I would say that no. I mean, I certainly get asked that by folks that we consult for a lot. It sort of comes back to the idea of beauty a little bit. And it's like when we're consulting for architects, let's say we're acting as maybe the passive house consultants. And, so a lot of them will be just give me a ratio to start with. And I'm always a little bit reluctant because I want them to stretch their design muscles, or flex their design muscles. And, we can always I want to see what they're thinking, and we can always find ways to adjust. The goal is to sort of find that right balance, is to provide the right amount of light for the space to be well daylit, but not too much glazing where there's glare. It needs to have the right aesthetic balance. I mean, and then there's all sorts of things we can do to address it, whether it's, the amount or the size or the position or shading or whatever. So it's, I tend to like to get into the design before I start to give people, ratios and kind of hard numbers. It's kind of like what I mentioned earlier about critical regionalism, right? Which asks, what is the right thing in this location for this project, for this program, in this very specific spot. And so that's the approach that I typically take.
I'm going to throw David under the bus a little bit. So he loves to do a preliminary energy model to get close so he can give the design team some guidance, even if it's internally, just a revision, or externally. But then it's also he wants to do the daylight model because the two need to influence each other. And then he wants to do a carbon model as well. Just preliminary stuff so we can benchmark everything and get it all appropriate. And then let those models mature so we get real factual data.
Yeah, it's the whole thing is always an iterative process, and with any kind of design process, it's one of negotiation.
Yeah, it's a good way to look at it.
So you start with the data, and then from there on, you develop the design.
I think we start with the intent.
Yeah.
With what's the owner's intent, and listen to that.
Right.
And then listen to what should be on that site, and see if we can start to rectify those two things, because sometimes they conflict. And then layer in the data. So we're not just doing what architects are trained to do, which is, I don't know, I'm just going to guess. We like facts and we like data because they drive decisions to figure out what the best solution is, what good looks like. And so we just keep using that throughout the design process to get to the best end goal.
But there's a certain amount of that's, it's intuition driven, but then we, that might be, even if we start with some intuition, we'll go back and kind of back it up with factual data.
And you get the intuition when you live in the desert. You got to live off the water that falls on your roof or live in a tent, because you get to understand the environment much better and you learn how to work with it rather than against it.
If you're enjoying the show, I have a small favor to ask that would mean the world to me. By rating and sharing the podcast, you're helping us grow and spreading our mission of making sustainability really desirable and cool to a wider audience. Besides of that, imagine impressing your colleagues with the latest insights on sustainable architecture. So make sure you follow the podcast and become the most informed in the room. Thank you so much for your support. You guys work on very different types of projects, residential, institutional, commercial buildings. How does your design process change for each type of project?
That's interesting. It does change for each kind of project because we have to look at what resources are available there, financially, environmentally, socially. And when we start a project, we then design that process for that specific resources. We don't pull the design out of drawer number 3. We don't repeat what we did last time. It is a lot more work for us, but we do it because we care. And we then customize a design process appropriate for those resources and that owner. And I think that's part of the reason we've been so successful and why we have so many repeat clients is once they see it's been designed for them, it's not, oh, we just did this design over there for the other guys. We're going to use the same one. We just ended up with a better product. The
other thing that we do, and Scott mentioned it, he mentioned the OPR, the owner's project requirements. That's kind of the fundamental, if there's anything that ties what we do together, it's probably the OPR. And so, which is just basically a slightly more intensive programming, really understanding what the owner needs, interviewing them, maybe interviewing staff, depending on who that owner is, and whether it's, if it's a residential client, right, it might be like understanding the things they like to do. Like they've got a big closet filled with games, right? Or this is their special cabinet where they put all their cocktail making equipment, right? Or this is a certain way that they like to entertain, or they like to sleep really cold, right? They like the whole house to be warm, but they want the bedroom cold, just anything that's specific to, and really unique to people.
To their needs, to the place that we're putting whatever building, if it's commercial or residential.
And then I think that you asked like how things change. I mean, I think that one of the things that does change quite a bit is actually sustainability and the sustainability goals, because every project has a different set of constraints. Whether it's budget or site or just existing conditions, et cetera. And so what we try to do is find that our client's level of comfort, and they may have really specific sustainability goals. They might say, we want a certified passive house, or they might just say, we want it to be as good as we can get it. Or maybe their thing is water, or maybe it's
human comfort,
daylighting,
toxicity,
we've consulted for clients who were super, super sensitive about mold, right? So we had to get really intensive about, hydrothermal safety. That's the way that our goals as they relate to sustainability can shift depending on the clients.
I think some goals that we try to keep consistent, I'm going to flip it around on you. Like some of the goals in sustainability that we try to keep for consistent. Every building we design, we try to make sure that solar panels, photovoltaics, can be put on the roof at some point. We'll do the structural math, show it on the drawing. So long after David and I are gone, some other architect can pick it up and they don't have to spend $20,000 to do a structural study. Information's right there. And we size the roof correctly. And there's conduit under the roof, so you don't have to add an additional penetration.
Whether it's conduit run to the roof or conduit run to the parking lot.
Oh,
or sizing, leaving room at the electrical panels for future solar equipment. We try to do a certain amount of kind of future proofing, so that even if the project can't hit all of the sustainability goals on day one, they'll be able to easily do it, in year 5 or whenever,
We're also always trying to keep our clients, even commercial clients, in the building and let them grow over time. So when we're planning out a building, we will actually plan in schematic design where the next addition is going to go. And we've had clients who've designed buildings, and 10 years later, a client calls us back and says, I outgrew this building. You got to help us find another site so we can build another building. I'm like, no, go back to the schematic drawing we gave you 12 years ago. Open it up and then call me back. 20 minutes later, I get a call because he found the drawing, and he's like, oh, you just saved me $10 million.
So in that case, we're thinking about like design for disassembly.
Yeah.
How do we do an addition with the least amount of demolition, and disruption? And again, it's really about future proofing and thinking about how people and companies' needs change, and what would be the potential likely next step in that process.
Yeah, future proofing and this flexibility that in the end brings longevity is easy to be skipped in the design process, but so important for the sustainability goals. And I think it's kind of undervalued.
It is definitely undervalued. We say in this firm, one of our guiding principles is we need to think more and build less. And it's thinking backwards, because architects are often paid by how much gets built. And we as a firm are like, no, we can show you how to build less.
That's a good point, actually. And it's probably an underappreciated aspect of sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're asking about embodied carbon earlier. And, the less you build, the lower the embodied carbon is. Now we want there to be sufficient space. We don't want it to be too small, but what is that right size? It's kind of the same question as what's the right window to wall ratio, or what's the right system sizing? It's really all about finding that right balance. And often, we had a educational client who, initially thought they were going to need a larger building, but through that programming process, the process of developing the OPR, we were actually able to reduce the square footage of the building, which saved them money, and certainly saves them energy. It takes less energy to run the building.
All the long-term
saves all the
operating
embodied
costs.
carbon.
Yeah. And not only that, I think they got a better building because they listened to us and how we organized the building, and we were able to put functions that needed a floor plate of 15 feet on the north side of the building with smaller windows, and then functions that needed 30 feet on the south side of the building with appropriately sized south-facing glass. We got 5,000 square feet out of the building, made it more efficient, made it more cost-effective, and it's also passive solar. Worked out pretty well. You just have to think a little differently to be able to get there.
And clients sometimes struggle to understand the value of sustainability or see it as too expensive. How do you approach those conversations?
That's easy. We show them the work that we've done, and they can see where the value is. You just, to have anybody understand, if you show them a good example of the value, then they understand. Even our office building was a great example. And so I'll say this: this is a now 175-year-old building. It is super energy efficient. Our EUI, or energy use per square foot per year, is about 15, which is, I don't know, maybe a fifth of a standard office building. So they can see that. But then I also need to explain another factor to them. The energy cost for the building is 50 cents a square foot per year. The cost for the employees in it in a standard building is $300 a square foot. When we studied our own building, it's $500 a square foot per year for our employees. If I can do anything to increase their productivity, their happiness, the length of time they spend here or stay here, it dwarfs all the other costs. So we have to change our mentality of how do I get the cheapest building to how do I get the best building for my people and for our mission. And if we do that, we just focus on different values.
Yeah, so I think, you asked how do we communicate? Well, Scott was talking about value, communicating that value. And I think it's really about finding out what's important to the clients and then speaking in their language. And so, and a lot of times this really involves taking a holistic approach. Because, so for example, so this is a real example. We're passive house consultants on a multifamily project, and the project was under construction, and the architects accepted a substitution for the DOAS system, the ventilation system. They accepted a substitution without consulting with us. And the ventilation system that they accepted was about $20,000 cheaper than the one that we had specified. And however, it was also much, much less efficient in terms of its energy use. And so what happened is that they saved $20,000 in buying that unit, but they had to spend an additional $60,000 for additional PV to make up for that inefficiency, because they had a specific energy target that they had to hit. And so really they ended up spending $40,000 more than they would have if they had just kept what we had spec'd.
A 30-second phone call to David, he would have been like, wait, let me use energy modeling and real facts to prove this out. And in an hour, he would have called them back and said, please don't do that.
Right. And I would have saved them some, a lot of money. But because all the phone calls themselves are expensive, right? But the point to that story is really about taking the time to look at things in a holistic way, to understand how one thing affects another thing. Because you can't just look at that one piece of equipment in isolation and say, oh, this one's cheaper, I'll swap it out. And that becomes, I think, a really effective strategy, that holistic viewpoint, and being able to, tie the different pieces together. So it's like, when I talk to clients, I'm trying to think of another good example, but, we can look at just like the stacked benefits of different things,
that's a key term and one worth talking about. The idea of stacked benefits is we're looking for sustainable solutions that have a benefit in energy or water or social system and benefits another too. So basically one action, you're then getting stacked benefits in many areas. And that means it's the right sustainable solution rather than just something that's a little bit greenwashing.
Okay, I have a very specific question regarding homeowners or private developers. So there are so many different certificates, or however you want to call them, Zero Energy Verified, Passive House Certified, LEED Platinum, Living Buildings Certified. How does a homeowner or a developer know which one is the best for them?
I look at it this way. It's going to sound funny, and because we consult in all these different rating systems.
I can see that.
Yeah. It doesn't matter. I mean, it matters big picture, but it's like, if you haven't done one, start on one. Look at one. In fact, look at 3. Take the best stuff from one and put it into the other. Make your own. You can certify under one system. Let's say you certify under Passive House. But then pull the best stuff from LEED and definitely the best stuff from Living Building Challenge, and put them together to get the best end result for that circumstance with those available resources. There's no right or wrong here.
Yeah, that's kind of like getting back to what I was saying about, talking to the clients, understanding their needs and figuring out, like, helping them to figure out what the right balance is, in regards to their sustainable goals, and sometimes it evolves. We had another project where it was Living Building Challenge Core and LEED Platinum. And frankly, the way to achieve those projects is to build a passive house, particularly the Living Building Challenge requirements. And so we designed it using passive house methodology. And then when we were in construction and we passed the blower door test, we did all the testing and balancing and commissioning. The client was like, "Wait, is it too late to get passive house?" And but because we had essentially designed it as a passive house anyway, we were able to retroactively go back, and we're working through those final stages of getting it certified now.
And this is a client that didn't come to us and say, "I want a passive house, I want a LEED Platinum, and I want a Living Building Challenge project." They came to us and just said, you should design a project that's like LEED Silver equivalent and just make it really good. And we said, sure. And then we designed what good should be. And when we got the construction documents, they said, maybe you should do the Living Building Challenge thing. We said, sure, we got that. And then they said, well, just because LEED is a name brand, you should maybe do the LEED thing too. I'm like, we got it. And then Passive House came after construction was done. The point that I'm trying to make here.
Well, the certification. We always use the methodology.
Always. The point that I'm trying to make is, it's not the client's responsibility to figure out what the right thing is. It's the architects. It's the designers. It's our responsibility to design to those standards, whether the client wants it or not. If they want the certification, great. If they don't, great. It's our responsibility as designers to do what good is.
And, it's getting easier to do that, honestly, because when we first started working on passive house projects, we were on the 2009 code, and Pennsylvania was on that code for far too long.
A decade too long.
And the distance between, say, 2009 building code and passive house it's big. It's a big gap, in terms of cost and intensity of construction. But now we're on the 2018 code, and that gap is closed significantly. So it's a much, much lighter lift to achieve some of these above code standards. And now we're actually seeing, and this is super encouraging, we're seeing municipalities adopt things like passive house as just their code standard. Massachusetts has done incredible work.
New York is probably close behind.
Yeah, New York has done a lot of great work, as well as other places across the country. And there's other places throughout the world that have been doing this for a long time. And, I think we'll broadly catch up at some point, hopefully soon. But it's getting easier, even just the normal baseline code.
So I have one last question for you. Scott, if you had to, you said you would pick the best of each certificate. If you had to develop the Scott Kelly revision certificate, what are 5 things that you would definitely put in there?
That is such a great question.
What would I put in there?
I love that question.
I mean, I'd say it this way, and I'm looking towards you on purpose here. How do we not look at a resiliency that folds in energy, water, and toxicity? We would have to look at the biophilic aspects of what we design because of how it affects us as human beings and even our attitude towards each other. So you'd have to have some benchmark on biophilia. You'd have to have some benchmark on resiliency that would address energy, water, and material toxicity.
Yeah, I don't know what those specific benchmarks are. I mean, I think in general, kind of maybe the highest level one is how do you get to net zero?
You have to get to net zero.
And
we
then,
have to get to net zero on every project we do.
And then we're looking at, like you said, I think resiliency is huge. Passive survivability is enormous.
Look at what just happened in North Carolina. Right? If you had taken one of our buildings from up here and put it in North Carolina, you'd have 10,000 gallons of drinking water for people who had no drinking water. Maybe 20. And so we just need to think differently as a society, and we need to think differently as a profession. And we have to have people understand that it's our responsibility to design what good is.
Yeah. And I don't think that, I just want to emphasize material toxicity again, because, we can be, if we're not, again, it comes back to looking at things holistically, right? And we have sustainability goals, but then if we're using bad materials to get there, we're undermining those goals that we're trying to achieve.
One of the ways we look at this whole equation about carbon is we can get on the right path and design all the projects that address global climate change and CO2 emissions, or the equivalent of CO2 emissions. But if we do not address the toxicity that we are going into the earth and taking out and putting into our biosphere, into our habitable zone, we're not going to end well. We can fix global climate change, but we also have to address the toxicity, because the toxicity will be here for 500,000 years. We can't get around it. We need to get smarter now and not wait.
That's super nice. Scott and David, if our listeners want to follow what your vision does or what you do, where can they find you?
Well, we're definitely on Instagram.
We're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn.
And our website is www.revisionarch.com.
You can connect with us there and we'll reach back out to you.
That's cool. I'm going to link it in the description of the episode so people can definitely find you.
Okay, Ladina, keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.
We really appreciate everything you're doing, and thank you again for this invitation. It's been fantastic to talk with you.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at Ladina Ship. Thanks.